We'll highlight some tales from the golden age of Wisconsin sporting life with the author of History Afield. Robert Willging is my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me tonight is Robert Willging, a wildlife biologist. He's also an author. In his latest book, he shares stories of Wisconsin's heritage as a great place for recreation, fishing, and hunting. Take a look.
History Afield, Stories from the Golden Age of Wisconsin Sporting Life, is a tribute to those who have long enjoyed outdoor pursuits. It includes a first-hand account of a trout fishing expedition in the 1800s, and a time when duck hunting took place in the spring. Author Robert Willging also shares stories of some early resorts and vacationers who flocked to the Northwoods. Carl Marty had an affinity for wild animal orphans. Celebrities who stayed at his Northern Air resort included burlesque stripper Gypsy Rose Lee. Willging highlights a company famous for its fishing lures and a sports shop in operation for 90 years. He tells how a record-breaking muskie put Hayward on the map, and a harrowing tale of survival of fishermen trapped on an ice floe in Lake Superior. Robert Willging is a wildlife biologist and an avid outdoorsman. Many of the stories in his book stem from his columns as an outdoor writer. His first book was On the Hunt, The History of Deer Hunting in Wisconsin.
Bob, who was Ed Keeler and why was he murdered?
Ed Keeler was an interesting character. He was one of the first residents of the town of Enterprise, or his family was, which is a township near Rhinelander up north. And he was kind of did all sorts of things. He had a boat on, he lived near Pelican Lake, which is one of the biggest lakes in Oneida County.
Sure.
And he ran tourists. This was turn of the century into the early 1900s, and his boat would take tourists from the train depot at Pelican Lake and deposit them on the resorts. He also delivered groceries and things like that.
Kind of an entrepreneur.
Yeah, he was an early entrepreneur. He was a farmer, and in the winter time, he would go in the woods and trap. And his murder came about from his trapping. He went into the woods in the winter to spend a couple days at his trapping shack, his trapping cabin, and he never came back. He was shot and killed, and then...
Now, they didn't know that right away. They had to go searching for him, right?
Right. After he didn't come back, after a couple days, they mounted a search party and found that he had been shot and left there, actually bled to death because he wasn't killed outright by the single shot.
Did they ever find anybody?
No, I don't think they ever did. You know, the newspaper accounts at the time just, they talk about the search party, and they don't know if it was an intentional shooting or if perhaps somebody thought he was a deer, except it seems like he was out in the open. But it could have been an accidental shooting, but whoever did the shooting act didn't stick around to try and save him.
Wow.
They just left, and like I said, he bled to death out
So
in the
they
woods.
thought that maybe it was somebody who thought he was shooting at a deer.
That was a possibility.
Because it didn't seem likely that somebody would go out to murder Ed Keeler.
Right. It didn't seem like he had any enemies that would be waiting for him.
And he was perfectly at home in the woods. He was he knew it. He was trapping. Was there any money in trapping?
Yeah, there was. This was during the Depression, and that was one way, especially in the North, to get hard cash was trapping, even though it was highly regulated at the time. A lot of people did trap. And that, because of it was the 1930s, thoughts about moonshiners or gangsters, that kind of ran through town. And, but probably it was an accidental shooting, but the person
Panicked,
yeah.
and ran, and they never, it was an unsolved murder.
Right. And
wow. We talked a little bit about the fur trade. When did that start in Wisconsin?
Oh boy, that goes back to the French first contact with the Europeans, with the French. And there's probably some fur trading going on even before Nicolay came to Wisconsin in the 1600s. The fur trade had already been established east of Wisconsin, and then the French expanded were expanding farther west and entered Wisconsin and expanded the trade through the Great Lakes states.
So it was mainly the French, as far as the Europeans were concerned. The Indians had traded among themselves, of course, for a long, long time. But they weren't all French. There was a Carl Schell's that you wrote about. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, Carl, he came along again in the 1930s. Quite a few of the stories in the book come from that era. And he was unemployed in Chicago, decided he was going to try to earn his keep up in northern Wisconsin. So he bought a car from an uncle, went up to Oneida County, and just found odd jobs to begin with. And eventually he figured out how to trap. He taught himself how to trap. And the difference between him and Edward Keeler is that Carl was kind of an outlaw beaver trapper.
Oh, really?
And yeah, at the time, beaver were highly regulated. The season was highly regulated, but the population was coming back pretty good. So there's a lot of illegal beaver trapping going on.
A little poaching going on.
Yeah, and there was good money in it too.
Okay.
So.
And he was self-taught, and people weren't always nice to him, were they?
No, he was trying to find work up north in the middle of the Depression, so he took whatever he could find. But he was a pretty sharp guy, and he learned that the money he could earn, he put into buying 40s that were tax delinquent.
So 40-acre
40-acre
okay.
parcel, yeah. And when he started buying the 40s, he harvested the timber that was left on them. They were already had been logged by the old-time loggers, the white pine loggers, and he would take what was left, cut that by hand, and sell that. And every step of the way, he improved his life a little bit and made a little bit more money, and he just never gave up. He was just a really hard worker.
Wow.
And
we don't think about doing that today, going up into the North Woods. Coming from Chicago, he didn't know anything about the woods, really.
Right. He was a city kid to begin with, and taught himself how to
He had
log
to be
and
one
how to
tough
trap.
guy.
Yeah, he was, and he ended up making his living becoming a logger, a sawmill owner in Eagle River, and it established a pretty good business for himself after his initial early days.
So it's a success story.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned logging, and there's in your book, there's a wonderful connection drawn between Wisconsin timber and Cornell University. Explain that to me.
Sure. That's something a lot of people don't realize, and something I kind of came across during my research for the book that I had no idea how extensive. I had heard a little bit about this story, but what happened was during the Civil War, the country was still growing, or the North was still growing, and states wanted to build universities, but money was short. And what the federal government did was pass a law called the Morrill Act, and it's also known as the Land Grant College Act.
That's where I recognize it, yeah.
Right, and the idea was to provide a federal support for colleges, for the establishment of colleges in the states, in the northern states. And what the Land Grant College Act did was basically allot a certain amount of public land to each state so that they could sell it and use that money to build universities.
Okay, sure. We built the University of Wisconsin, of course.
Right, exactly. And what Ezra Cornell did, he wanted to build a college in New York, in his hometown of Ithaca. And he learned about this. He was already a pretty wealthy man at this point in the 1860s. And he got the state to issue the allotment to him. And what the federal government did was allot the land in scrip. So you got so many acres of scrip, which I imagine, a document. And then the states could pick out what public lands they wanted. And Ezra saw that.
So instead of going to the state of New York, state of New York's went to Ezra Cornell.
Right.
Pulled a few strings to do that.
He pulled some strings, yeah. He was a pretty political guy, powerfully politically powerful.
So he ends up with a stack of scrip that is, each one of which is good for a certain amount of land.
Right. And New York, because it was the largest state with the largest members of Congress, is how they decided how much scrip a state would get. And New York had the most seats in Congress, so they got the most scrip. But the problem was there wasn't a lot of public land in New York. So Ezra thought, he kind of looked towards the west to the developing states and bought some land in Iowa, some in Wisconsin, and some in Minnesota. But he really happened on the white pine in Wisconsin, which was just beginning to be logged at a large scale.
How do you know that?
And he had some contacts in Wisconsin, and somebody he knew suggested to him that that might be a good place to invest the scrip, and that's what he did in a big way. He ended up using most of the scrip for Wisconsin pine lands, and he was speculating a lot of the states just sold their scrip right away, got their land and sold the land off right away and got instant cash.
I think that's what Wisconsin did.
Right. They
so they didn't end up. We didn't end up with nearly the money that Ezra Cornell did.
Right. They didn't. Wisconsin didn't speculate, but Ezra saw that if you hung on to it, speculated in the land, the price of the timber, the lumber, was going to go up as the states got more established and more settled. So it was a big land speculation venture, and it turned out to be highly successful, where New York made over $5 million.
Wow.
And compared to Wisconsin, that made about $300,000 on their scrip.
Yeah, and they stole all of our land.
Yeah. and
one of the great stories in your book is the story of the great duck hunt on Armistice Day and the storm.
Right.
What happened?
That was a really famous storm, especially in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and a lot of old-time hunters still remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those guys were maybe kids at the time. But what happened, it was Armistice Day in 1940, and the duck season in Wisconsin and Minnesota had been really warm, mild weather, and the northern ducks hadn't come down from Canada
not good
yet.
duck hunting.
Not good at all. It was kind of bluebird weather. And on Armistice Day, it turned out to be the same way. It was in the 50s or 60s in the morning, and guys went out, hunters went out in just light clothing and expected another bluebird day for duck hunting.
Ooh.
And then towards the afternoon, this big storm that had been developing out of the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle region had been gaining strength as it swept across the Great Plains. And it hit Minnesota first along the Mississippi River and into western Wisconsin in the afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Armistice Day, and just caught the duck hunters by complete surprise. And by the time it got here, it was just a raging fury. The temperatures dropped 40, 50 degrees.
Wow.
It was horizontal, 60 to 70 mile an hour winds. And
So if you were on a lake, you couldn't get off because the wind would push you back in.
right, a lot of hunters got trapped out in their skiffs or on little islands in the Mississippi first, and then the storm, really wreaked havoc there. But then it zipped across the state and caught duck hunters on all the big bodies of water in the state, all the way over to Lake Butamore and went out into Lake Michigan too, and actually sunk some ships that were on Lake Michigan. So it was one of the biggest storms. It was actually a storm of the century in a way, because it came about because of a massive cold air system in Canada that met right here in Wisconsin, or kind of as it built here, met really moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, and just.
And were there deaths?
Yeah, quite a few. I think the total was about 150.
Wow.
Between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and the majority of those, it sounds like, were people out that were waterfowl hunting and got trapped on the waters and just died of exposure during the night because they couldn't get back to safety.
You wrote a book about deer hunting.
Yes.
And I was fascinated by that because of something that you put in there. It had to do with the white-tailed deer. When did the white-tailed deer come from Europe?
Oh, millions of years ago.
So really, they were always here.
Yeah, they came, right. They evolved in North America. So the precursor to the whitetail came across probably the Bering Sea land bridge,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sometime millions of years ago when that was exposed and animals could go back and forth between Eurasia and North America. But then once it got here, it evolved into the white-tailed deer and became, you know, the animal we know today just from those the pressures of millions of years ago of competing with all the herbivores we had in North America and the predators. It became an animal that was really good at survival. And
It still is, darn it.
yeah, that's why it's such a challenge for hunters today. So.
Exactly. Anybody that goes into the woods thinking that all they have to do is sit there and the deer is going to walk by.
Right. They're equipped for escape and
Yes.
surviving. So.
And if somebody were to go back then, let's say you and I go back to I don't know, 100 years, 200 years,
Mm-hmm.
what changes would we see in deer hunting over those years?
Quite a few. You know, going back a couple hundred years or into the period where we mentioned the fur trade.
Mm-hmm.
When that European fur trade was still going on, the hide trade, the white-tailed deer hide trade, was a big part of that. We tend to think of the fur trade as the beaver skin
Sure.
and the beaver fur hat.
Yep.
But the hide trade, the deer hides were in big demand by the Europeans. And then we kind of transitioned to where that European Indian hide trade really depleted the deer population in the state. So nothing much happened for a while. But then the deer started to come back as pioneers in the early 1800s came into the state. So that's the next phase is the subsistence hunting by the early pioneers.
Who were market hunters?
The market hunters were kind of about the same time, the early 1800s into the middle 1800s, where deer kind of mirrored the hide trade that the Indian European trade, where deer were taken for the market for making money.
So you shot as many of them as you could.
Yeah, there were
And
no
it was legal.
regulations at that time, and it was an easy way to make hard cash. And the deer, at the beginning of market hunting, were abundant. And the difference with there was hide trade with the more modern market hunting era of the 1800s, but there was also the venison, the meat trade that went along with that.
Sure.
And that really, the demand for wild game at that time, that was Civil War era. After the Civil War, all the restaurants in the big cities served wild game, and venison was in big demand for the fancy restaurants.
I found so many interesting things in History Afield, your book, and one of them was that I had no idea that the state of Wisconsin had a fur farm.
Right.
Where was it? When was this?
The game farm that still exists today in Poynette, it's still there. They raise lots of pheasants for releasing
okay.
pheasants.
And that was originally fur.
It was both.
Oh.
But in the early days, the 1930s and 1940s, up through the 1960s, I believe, they had some different parts of the game farm, and one of them was the fur farm, it was called. And they did a lot of experimenting with different types, raising captive animals. And the idea behind that was that the captive fur market, the fox market, fur farm market, was pretty big in Wisconsin in the 30s and 40s. So it was kind of a support for that economic activity. They tested vaccines to get rid of distemper in fox, and they did some cross breeding of different kinds of different fur colors. And one of the most interesting things that I had not been aware of was they raised raccoons to be released in the wild, and the idea was to maybe get different strains, different fur colors of raccoons in the wild. Yeah.
It's hard to think of raising raccoons because there's so many of them now.
Right. Today there's so many, but at that time in the 30s they were pretty.
Did they come up with any interesting colors? Did it ever work?
I don't think it worked too good. I think they did try to come up with a darker phase raccoon, kind of a black raccoon, and they did release them on an annual basis for many years, but I don't think anything ever, came of it. I think probably the most benefit to it was more raccoons for the hound hunters. The coon hunters were a pretty big constituency in the state at that time too, and I think that was part of the reason the fur farm existed too, was for the hunting aspect of things.
I also didn't realize that Wisconsin has a state dog.
Yeah, the American Water Spaniel is Wisconsin's state dog, and
who slipped that through? I never heard of that one.
You know, I think I don't know all the details on when it became the state dog, but I think it was a school project that a teacher in his class did in the 1970s, petitioned the governor to make the Water Spaniel a state dog, based on its history in the state, that it really is a dog that was a breed that was developed in Wisconsin.
Oh, really?
And right, it basically occurred around New London, the New London area, where, going back to the discussion about market hunting, it was a dog used by the market hunters for waterfowl hunting. There was market hunting for deer in a big way in the state, but also for waterfowl. And the market hunters in Wisconsin had this little brown spaniel, and a prominent doctor in New London called Doc Pfeiffer, he realized that this was a unique breed, and he started to breed the little brown spaniel himself into what we know as the American Water Spaniel today, which is a distinct breed. We
can't talk about history of Afield without talking a little bit about fishing. We've done all this talk about hunting and fur and timber, but this was sort of the playground of a couple of presidents, wasn't it, for fishing?
Oh yeah, definitely. The ones that come to mind, or the most prominent, are Eisenhower. When he was still General Eisenhower, he came to the state in 1946, I believe.
The first time?
The first time, right. At the request of the governor, or the governor's secretary had run into his people, and they made this plan for him to get out of Washington. And he was in the midst of post-war duties, and he needed a break. So they brought him to Minocqua, and the state treated him really well. It was State Department of Conservation wardens were his guides, and his protection was from the state.
And people left him alone. They respected his privacy.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing.
It's a great story. And he came with all of his brothers, all four brothers.
Yeah, it was the 5 Eisenhower brothers together.
Wow.
Which made some great pictures, and there's pictures of them all holding up their own muskie.
And they all got muskies.
Yeah.
One of them got a big northern. But there was prior to that, Calvin Coolidge used to come here.
Yeah, that's a really amazing story too. You know, talking about how Eisenhower was left alone. Calvin Coolidge took his whole office, White House office, and moved it to the Boise Brule River in Douglas County, and he stayed at a wealthy person's estate there called Cedar Island, and he spent the entire summer there.
Wow, can you imagine the president taking the entire summer off?
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine today.
Wasn't there a controversy because he was fishing for trout, but people didn't trust that he was going to be a fly fisherman?
Right. That's a really interesting part of the story. Is I did a lot of researching with the old newspapers and the newspaper stories, articles at the time. The big subject about Coolidge at the time he was there was, would Coolidge uphold the sanctity of the Brule River, which is known for its fly fishing and its trout fishing, and it's world renowned.
And he was a worm dunker.
Yeah, he wasn't an outdoorsman early on. He kind of got into fishing late in life. And the year before that, he had gone to the Black Hills and stayed at the State Game Lodge there, and that's kind of his first fishing adventures. And that's where he used the worms. And people had known about that. And they were the residents of Brule, which is right on the Brule River there. They were pretty scared that he was going to
go up and soak worms.
Yeah, soak worms.
But he didn't.
No, he actually learned how to fly fish from one of the Native American guides in town there. And he learned how to paddle a birch bark canoe, and he loved it. He spent more time than people thought he should be spending on the Brule.
I don't know if it was in Wisconsin, but there's a famous anecdote told about Calvin Coolidge. A woman came up to him and said, "Mr. Coolidge, I've got a bet that I bet someone that I could get you to say more than 2 words." And he said, you lose.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And there's a famous fishing lure that was created and it's still in business here.
Right, the MEPS company in Anago. Mm-hmm. Everybody that fishes, you know.
Oh, we've all got one somewhere in the tackle box.
Yeah, MEPS spinner. Mm-hmm. And that was an interesting story. Anago is pretty close to Rhinelander, so when I was writing for the book, I went down there and talked with the president of the company and kind of learned the whole history of MEPS, that the lure itself was a product of France. That's where it was developed, the MEPS spinner. And it's still, even today, the components are made in France and assembled in Antigo and shipped from Anago.
The book is History Afield, Stories from the Golden Age of Wisconsin Sporting Life by Robert C. Willging. Bob, what a delight to meet you and to do this show. Thanks for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for being with us, as always, and helping us remember. Join us next time.